Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Active Inference Insights. I'm your host, Darius Parvizi-Wayne, and today I am truly honoured to be speaking to one of this century's most important philosophers, Professor Thomas Metzinger. Thomas is Professor Emeritus of Theoretical Philosophy at Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz, co-founder of the German Effective Altruism Foundation, and president of the Barbara Wenger Foundation. In 2019, he founded the Minimal Phenomenal Experience, or MPE project, and just this year released the book The Elephant and the Blind, which details the results of that project, bringing together more than 500 experiential reports to offer the world's first comprehensive account of states of pure consciousness. His work focuses on consciousness, and he is best known for establishing the self-model theory of subjectivity. Thomas, Professor Metzinger, we've spoken on email. We've had our we've had our email threads, but it's actually so lovely to kind of see you, albeit virtually. So thank you so much. Honestly, it's an absolute honor. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm a massive fan of yours. I mean, in the latest version of the Flow States paper, it has Metzinger 2003, 2004, 2005, 2000, and so on.
Yeah, something wrong with you. Thanks for having me anyway.
No, well, it's one of those things. I mean, with respect to your work, I feel like the past year has been sort of half Active Inference, half Metzinger.
Ah,
So
a
yeah,
recipe for disaster, but let's look at it.
no, it's been fun. I mean, I think a good place to start for the audience is to kind of out before we get into the new book, because I do want to touch on that, is to first outline the self-model theory of subjectivity, the
Yeah,
so-called SMT, because it might strike people as initially rather counterintuitive. So perhaps you could just give a brief account of the fundamental um, claims or axioms of the SMT with respect to its kind of key constraints, whether that's transparency, globality, and so on.
yeah. So in the Anglo-Saxon world, there's this absolutely unreadable 2003 book, Being No One. This actually has a precursor. Most of you will not know. In the German system, we have two major theses. We have a PhD thesis, and 5 years later, we have a habilitation thesis, which is a much bigger thing. My committee was 17 people.
Wow.
And in 1993, I published a book called Subjekt und Selbstmodell, the subject and self model. And the subtitle was The Perspectivalness of Phenomenal States from the Perspective of a Naturalist Theory of Mental Representation. So this already tells you what this is actually about. So being in the consciousness community, I'm one of the guys that founded the ASSC in 1994. I was always of the opinion that consciousness is not one problem, but a whole bundle of problems, some more empirical, some more conceptual, and that the center, the most difficult thing is what is a first person perspective? What makes a state a subjective state in any given information processing system? So I set out to tackle this. And then 10 years later, I had a wonderful year, one of the two best years in my academic career at UC San Diego, where Paul and Patricia Churchland hosted me. It was absolutely great in the philosophy and the cognitive science department. And I wrote the whole thing in English and updated it in that year in the 8th floor of the HSS building, Humanities and Social Sciences. And I thought, you can't do that title. Americans need something more crude.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I said, call the book Being No One. And that is what you have now. And the idea, this is indirectly, it's also trying to make a contribution to the problem of consciousness. But the idea is to say, what is a first person perspective, really? Because everybody in neuroscience or in philosophy talks about, for instance, like Dave Chalmers would be 1 pp facts and 3 pp facts. But the notion of a first person perspective is taken as a conceptual primitive, as if we all knew what that is. But it's actually a hybrid metaphor. So you have the first person pronoun, And there's a lot of good work in analytical philosophy of mind on, if there's some irreducibility in indexical expressions like I myself. That's so to speak the linguistic, the surface level. And perspective is a term from another discipline, geometry. People who work in geometry can tell you something about what a perspective is. Parallel lines meet in infinity, and so on and so forth. But together, you know, one could say it is the epistemic perspective that a system gains if it can refer to itself in the first person singular. If it can use, say, an expression like I by saying, I'm particularly happy and relaxed right now, ascribe a phenomenal state to itself. But then this would exclude all systems that can't use language, all higher vertebrates and animals. And well, we can go about what I really think a first person perspective is. I think it's a model of the intentionality relationship. Maybe we can come back to this later. And in my own, to make the connection to active inference. So I'm much older than you are. I'm 66 years now. For me, the really first big intellectual revolution was to discover Anglo-Saxon analytical philosophy of mind and get out of this continental swamp I grew up in the Frankfurt philosophy department. And I'm very grateful to the older philosophers, people like Peter Biri and so forth, who is already died, who poisoned young German philosophers by importing Anglo-Saxon analytical philosophy of mind, where we discovered, wow, we've had this military catastrophe and everything in this century. But in other places on the planet, philosophy has gone on. We just had total destruction in our country for decades and lost our intellectual traditions, teacher-disciple relationships. So I I really went into analytical philosophy of mind. That's one thing. Another thing is taking conscious experience really seriously, because it was kind of ignored by mainstream neuroscience. A third element is opening analytical philosophy of mind to neuroscience and cognitive science to organize interdisciplinary cooperation. And then maybe the second or third really intellectual revolution in my life was connectionism and neural networks. And, you have Andy Clark, microcognition 1989 in your country was super seminal and important for us, and early work of Paul Churchland also, and sub-symbolic representation, this whole debate, Fodor, compositionality, and all this was very interesting. And when Carl came out in 2010, I've made a decision for myself that I'm too old, that I'm just not gonna go into this on a formal level. So when for instance, the 2003 book used the term model, mental model, it is not a model in that terminological framework.
Yep.
So, as I say in the preface, this is all just introduction to the self-model theory of subjectivity. The first inspiration, I mean, of course, roots run deeper, but there is a book by Philip Johnson Laird that was called Mental Models, about relational data structures. And there's a tradition in theories of mental representation, into which we looked very deeply in German philosophy. Maybe 20 years ago, we discussed very deeply different models of mental representation and their history. And there was a guy in 1943, Kenneth Craig, who wrote a book, The Nature of Explanation. And there you have, for the first time, that's the classical locus for the notion of a model, a mental model. Relational data structure that have a partial homomorphy to the relational structure of what they represent. So that's where the term self-model came from me.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of technical stuff there, diagrammatic reasoning.
Right.
How can systems think with image-like structures and not with symbol calculus? That's where it comes from. And step one, I think there are three major steps. Maybe step one was to apply this to conscious self-representation and say, okay, there must be something like a phenomenal self-model beyond linguistic representation by mental models, the whole technical universe there. The second thing is the notion of transparency, which actually originated in your very own country with G.E. Moore,
Mm-hmm.
to apply this to the idea of a phenomenal self-model, and ask what would happen to a system if not the external model of the world were transparent, meaning could not be experienced as a representation, if it operated under a model of itself, a global integrated model of itself that was transparent, which the system itself could not experience as a representation, as an internal representation. And then the third step is, what does it need in addition to these two things to generate a consciously experienced first person perspective? Because you can imagine some systems, human beings, who are, say, completely conscious, wide awake, who have a self model, say, a robust body model, say, some state of stupor or total absent mindedness or something like this, but who do not have a subjective perspective on the world in any interesting sense. At least they don't experience. They may have one in epistemological reading, but phenomenologically, they are not directed to the world as knowing selves. And what is the difference there? And well, I think it's that systems like us even model the intentionality relationship. We can postpone that. So there, I try to construct a theory, a naturalist theory, how something like consciously experienced first person perspective could have naturally evolved. What else do you think listeners should know about the self model? So the main point is, everybody thinks this is a theory of consciousness. No,
Mm.
the aim was to have an experience of subjectivity.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So okay. The thing is, there's plenty. There's plenty, and I think in my experience is that the notions have been developed chronologically in some ways. Like I sense there's a focus in your work towards the epistemic agent model, the epistemic self model in the sort of 2013, 2014 Metzingerian stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I want to go all the way back.
Yeah.
I think a really good place to start for people, in my experience, was the Précis to Being No One, which is this 2005 paper. Um, so there you talk about simulation and emulation, and I think that's a nice place to start. Which is that in self models we have an emulating and simulating system and a target system, and it just so happens that in the self model those things are the same. And
Hmm.
so I've always thought about, with your work, the kind of notion of a strange loop or recursivity, such that there's a part of our information processing system that is targeted at itself, such that it simulates, and by simulates you mean reflects or the output of the information processing system, and emulates the properties and states of that information processing system. Now, I don't think people will necessarily have an issue with that, right? This goes all the way back to cybernetics,
Yeah, yeah,
Cohen-Ashby, good regulator theorem. I guess what people might say is, okay, I have a model of myself, and in the sense, that model is embedded in a world model, so I'm also doing the same thing with respect to the world. Why is it that that process of simulation and emulation is giving rise to phenomenality? Why is it giving rise to subjective experience? And if we can pass these two things out, the what it is like to be a conscious being.
Hmm.
So, why again? It's a hard problem question, but I guess
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean.
it's worth asking just to get really to the nuts and bolts. What is it about that simulation and emulation act?
Well, so I think a simulation, if I first generate a simulation of you, I will simulate observable properties that my receptor systems, what I can see and hear of you, my visual representation of you, my auditory representation, I can simulate that. Then I can discover that you have unperceivable, invisible features too, namely that you are also a simulator. And I might simulate those properties of you, psychological properties, mental properties, if you want to put like a, which are not observable by this kind of sensorium, this kind of animal, which I am has. So I can, in mind reading, for instance, human beings can simulate each other and they can emulate each other. Now, the interesting thing is the reflexive case. I can have a body model, that's trivial, and I can also somehow simulate abstract properties of mine. That's where it already gets interesting. Like, are there actually, I mean, there's the interoceptive self model, but that's receptor based. What are these mental properties of myself? For instance, I may take myself to be a person. I live in a culture, in a society where we know the status of a person, and I know this, and then somehow I represent myself as a person, as a rational individual. That would be a very high level emulation. Now, does any of this need to be conscious? I don't think so. That's the $1 million question, of course. Um, I think that the largest part of the human self model is unconscious. And the question is, what is, if we take the global workspace metaphor as a proxy for a theory of consciousness, what part of the self model this organism has is currently globally available? What part of the self model, for instance, can voluntary attention be directed to? And what can you not direct your attention to? What part is available for selective motor control? To which parts of myself can this animal point? And I think most of the knowledge, the really robust knowledge, is of course unconscious. So what your colleague George Dean would call the homeostatic control model, which I think George has this very nice differentiation between an allostatic control model and a homeostatic control model. I think that's very useful in making those different levels in a human self model more precise. And of course, most of homeostatic control is totally unconscious. Um, breath, heartbeat, blood, body temperature. And in a sense, that's a self model, but it's not a phenomenal self model. And what is that part that needs to be elevated to global availability? what are the, so to speak, the functional, the neurocomputational properties that any given moment mark out the phenomenal partition? I have no answer to this, but I think that's the research question. So I don't think that you magically like pull yourself out of the swamp by having a strange loop trick of self-referentiality, and then the lights go on, you become conscious.
Mm, mm,
As I've tried to demonstrate for people who didn't know it in that new book, um, non-egoic self-awareness without a first-person perspective is a widespread phenomenon that we know. Consciousness can experience without a phenomenal self, and consciousness can exist with a subject-object distinction without any experience of being directed as a knowing self as the world. These are not necessary conditions. So it might be something entirely itself. I have wild speculative ideas, but nothing I could really argue for.
yeah, I definitely want to get into that. I guess a point of clarity for
Yes.
people is
Yes.
that so when you say that when it's written that the emulating simulating system and the target system are identical, is to mean that they are strictly identical in the sense that if we took the neurocognitive mechanisms, right, if we just went to the physical level, they would be the same? Or do we think that there's a higher order network in organisms that possess a self model that is solely reserved for the act of simulating and emulating?
That's an interesting question, and that's where it gets very tricky. So I think, of course, I think the phenomenal self model that is currently active in your brain right now is strictly identical with some physical subset of your brain properties. Probably it's best be described on a functionalist level as a time slice in a computational um, process. So it's not identical with you as a whole, with Darius as a whole. The idea is rather from an epistemological perspective, the subject is the organism as a whole. To achieve knowledge, conscious knowledge about itself, that organism has developed a neurocomputational tool. That tool is the phenomenal self model. But that's physically, of course, that's just a part of its nervous system, physically. So it's like the whole organism kind of refers or represents the whole organism consciously through a special part it has, a physical part.
Mm,
So in if that picture is roughly right, then saying they are identical is is not true. It's like the epistemic subject, what has that conscious self knowledge, and the intentional object, that what it is directed at, that's identical. In both
mm,
cases, it's the
mm,
organism as a
mm.
whole, but the tool that's being used is something in its brain. It's only a physical part. I
I
don't.
guess.
Does it make things clear, or is that confusing?
No, I think it makes it clearer for me. I mean, I don't know. God knows who it makes it clear for. I guess people might also be thinking, especially if they're uh, neuroscientists, let's say, that all that exists in the nervous system are these electrical signals, in
Mhm.
which there is no inherent distinction between the self and the world. Right?
Absolutely.
There's just sort of zeros and ones, let's say. How? I mean, does this require another computational mechanism to do the distinguishing? I mean, as you know, this is a classic problem in cognitive neuroscience and philosophy of mind, right? Like the so-called self-specifying process.
Yes.
Is there something about self-modeling? Because maybe this is worth explaining as well, that the self-model is always embedded in a world model.
Mhm.
Is there a way in which the system that's emulating and simulating itself does not take itself to be the whole world. Because if it, in
Yeah,
some
yeah,
sense,
yeah.
the whole world is almost encapsulated, embodied within the nervous system, such
Yes,
that it can be phenomenally represented. How does the system manage to make its distinction between itself and its lived world?
that's very important, and a lot of things need to be said there. Maybe as kind of a preface, we have to distinguish levels of description. For instance, a self model as described on the representational level of description, with something which has a content, and the content is the system as a whole. Or a self model that is described on some functional level of description, say more fine grained computational level of description by the causal structure. And that will be some computational process in the nervous system. And then, of course, at any given moment, there will be a neurobiological implementation. And there's a whole story which I exclude for now about intersubjectivity and social environments and all of this. And in making this distinction over the years, I've these distinctions, I found a very important one that gets many people confused is the distinction between a computational self model and a phenomenal self model. So there's this intuitive notion, this guy's talking about the ego and what I experience as myself, the egoic phenomenal self model. There are special cases where it's not entirely like that, but in general, I'm this thinking, walking, body controlling, feeling self. That's the phenomenal self model we have quite often during waking states. Now, if we look at the computational self model, then technically, and we just look at conscious representation, exactly what you said now is right. All of the world which I now experience as being external to me is technically an internal state. It's a virtual model. It's a prediction about what might happen next on many different levels. So, what it actually is, as I said in my popular book, The Ego Tunnel, it's like the walls of the ego tunnel. It's like a surface, but not a two-dimensional surface, a very high dimensional membrane or surface in that model with colors, objects, sounds, and stuff like this. And in that respect, it's a wholly internal affair, and the puzzle consists in, so if this is all an internal process, why is it so robustly experienced as the environment, as the external reality of the system? How does it make that distinction? And one aspect is, what am I the obvious cause of?
Yeah.
As you have written yourself, what is the domain which is highly predictable and which I can control? That's a candidate for what becomes the self model. But computationally, and if we just talk about consciousness thing, the whole thing, this whole room, the screen with your face, my face, that's a self model because it's a prediction of likely own states it's an anticipation, so in that sense it is neither. That's also interesting. It's a probability distribution. In that sense, it's neither real nor unreal. It is. That's what I mean by virtuality. It's strictly speaking, it's not real. It's all a massive, very complex hypothesis at every single moment. So how is this so fundamentally split? uh, First thing to say, I think, is we have, especially in the light of, say, the last 10, 15 years of theorizing, get away from this simplistic self world dichotomy. if this whole story about Markov blankets and so forth is true, there are many nested Markov blankets. And there are many statistical boundaries a living system creates. For instance, in its unconscious self-organization and elementary bioregulation internally to the organism. But I can well imagine that in this active inference framework, when I actually do change something in the body external world and try to make the world conform to some internal target state or something, um, there must be one really well defined, no nonsense, no woo woo phenomenology, feel good stuff, where in saying that the human self model pulsates across the boundaries of the organism. It sometimes dynamically runs loops through the environment. And I think it would be a major achievement if we could say all this in a formally precise way. Yet, all the time, I'm a very old fashioned guy. I think it remains true that phenomenal properties locally supervene on neurofunctional properties in the brain. That what is consciously experienced, even in skillful embodied interaction with the world, is fully determined by local neural activity in the brain. Even if the system develops a complex causal loop through the environment, conscious experience, the phenomenality as such, is locally constituted, locally generated, identical to a local process, I would say. And if that is true, we might in the end arrive at a situation where people say, consciousness is so uninteresting. It's just,
No,
you know
I
what I
doubt it.
mean?
I
But
doubt it.
but then these larger bubbles,
Right.
social bubbles, um, they might be theoretically much more interesting, maybe, than that local model in the brain. Last
So,
thing, let me just
yep,
last
sure.
thing. I have often asked myself the question you just put to me: what is the origin of self models? And I asked people, and I think a really good candidate is the immune system. Um, it's a low level, very low level process, and it's super efficient. We develop more than 1,000 malignant cells every day, and your immune system shoots every single one down every day, else you wouldn't be here. It's a very old process, it's very complex, it's not localized in the nervous system, but this process is one of the first processes, I think, that draws a boundary between this is me and this is not me. There are even people who speak about an immune self. And I think out of these entirely unconscious processes of trying to maintain the boundaries of a living organism, this is where it slowly grew out of, from a molecular level. And then, of course, did you come to in the new book, did you come to that notion of the single embodiment constraint?
No, I haven't.
Okay, and then I'll
I'm
say,
working my way slowly through it.
yeah, and a lot of people presently do. This is something I want to point out because it's a constraint which is so simple that most people overlook it. We, human beings, most animals, are beings where all effectors and sensors
Mm,
are located in a narrowly circumscribed space of physical space, location in physical space. We have a single embodiment. We have a single skin surface, pretty well defined. We are highly local beings.
mm,
We could imagine an artificial intelligence which has become conscious, which administrates a few thousand robots with sensors and effectors of their own all over the planet on the surface of other planets. That AI could look through the windows of many single embodiments, local embodiments of robots, without actually itself having a single embodiment. It could develop a very different kind of self model or mental properties than we have. But we are just these local entities. So for us, it's very obvious, physically localized in a single embodiment, all almost sensors and effectors all concentrated in one location in physical space. So the body model, the physical organism model, what can it do? Where can it climb? How fast can it
Mm.
run? This would also naturally have been something with a pretty simple boundary in space. And so on and so forth. I'm just trying to point out logically, this wasn't necessary. There could have been
Mm.
completely different intelligent creatures somewhere else in the universe, widely distributed or something.
Yes, it's a thought experiment that I guess is in some sense uh, impossible to conceive because of the boundedness of our
Yeah,
perspective on
that's
the world.
interesting, isn't it?
Well, maybe it isn't. I mean, maybe I can't. I mean, I've been reading a little bit of Peter Godfrey Smith, only the pop science on octopuses, octopodes, and he speaks a little bit about these kind of, the fact that octopuses seem to have a far more distributed cognitive system, which could imply multiple self models, one for each arm. I think what's interesting here is that thus far, everything you said would be highly convergent with the fluffy continentalists.
Hmm.
So,
Oh, the
oh,
self.
no, we'll get there. We will get there because, um, as you know, I'm very interested in these kind of self-specifying processes.
Yes,
So this is the work that really blossoms out of Dorothy Legrand's really wonderful sort of 5 years, where she's just writing these incredible articles about self-specifying processes. And thus far, I think what you're saying makes perfect sense, which is that her and Evan and others have said one of these self-specifying processes will be these efferent reafferent loops, and that is self-specifying because the cognitive system in some ways recognizes a signal that's caused by its action and a signal
okay.
that's caused by the
Yeah.
world.
Yes.
And then the other thing, interestingly, is actually in that 2011 TICS paper, specifying the self for cognitive neuroscience, they also talk about something akin to what you were mentioning with respect to the immune system, which is that homeostasis might itself be a self-non-self specifying function,
Absolutely.
because it's a self that's maintaining its integrity over a precarious world. Now, the tension, I think, lies in this self as subject, self as object distinction.
Okay.
Um, and this is where this is where I've really been digging in and trying to really get
Very
to the bottom.
interesting. Let's go there if you want to.
Well, I only briefly want to touch upon it because I think that Legrand would have an issue with this notion that at its very bare minimum, what you would call the minimal phenomenal selfhood, what she would call the self as subject or pre-reflective self-awareness, can be representational.
Yeah.
Rather, she would propose that, and I think people like Dan Sahavi and Sean Gallagher, and going all the way back to Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, that these are just this is just a subjectivity that's immanent in all experience,
Yeah.
and it structures the world which it intends, if that makes any sense. Um, how can you how can you get pre-reflective self-awareness, self as subject, uh, and keep your representationality? How do you make those two marry?
This brings up, I'm going to share an anecdote with you. So many years ago, Francisco Varela,
Mm.
and all these guys, they have this dogmatic thing. they don't know what they mean when they talk about representationalism, but they know representations are bad. And they
Yeah, yeah,
think
yeah.
it is something rigid, a representandum and a representatum, and it's a rigid relationship and it could never be alive and all that. So Francisco Varela invited me and David Chalmers to Paris to give talks, and then he listened to my self-model talk, and he came to me afterwards and he said, Thomas, everything you say is absolute. You're right. I can subscribe to everything, but you're totally lost as long as you don't give up your representationalism.
There you go.
You're doomed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And of course, this is nothing new. They all say that, but what they haven't properly followed, this intellectual tradition, is, I mean, the concept of representation has developed over some 350 years, and people, Descartes, Malebranche, and people have thought about it. And I think only a very small part of the continental phenomenology tradition have even grasped neural networks and the fluidity and context sensitivity of neural networks and dynamical systems and all this stuff cognitive science has been through. Representations can be something very much alive and
Mm,
super context sensitive, and I think it's very obvious that our concept of representation is evolving. If you think, of the whole predictive processing framework, how it is evolving. But personally, I'll just tell you what my personal stance on this is. The representationalist, so I'm an instrumentalist but not a realist about representations. I make no statement if anything like that exists in the world
mm,
metaphysically. All I'm saying is, at this stage of scientific progress, we're in last 40 years, maybe, modern cognitive science, the concept of representation, which is being continuously enriched and calibrated and refined. You may remember that in Being No One, I talked about presentation,
mhm,
representation, simulation, all that, is still useful. It is still heuristically fecund to use that level of description. But there will be some stage in scientific progress where we probably discard this and say, okay, now let's say a Carnes model goes through, somebody will say, okay, it's now all a part of statistical physics or something like this. We notions of content, of notions of a belief, or notions of a model, however technically refined, is not something we need anymore. We can do it
mm.
all on a lower level of description. And I mean, the super frightening question is, of course, if this could happen to phenomenology itself, to consciousness.
Yeah.
People would eliminate that concept because they have more fine-grained, lower-level concepts. So I'm not wedded to the representationalist level of description, but I still think, and that brings us back to our conversation also, I still think it is very useful, for instance, speaking in terms of models and self-models still, and say, well, now we mean something more predictive processing-ish by it, and not something Johnson Laird-ish by it.
Yeah.
Although one can see, if one looks, there's an intellectual tradition there. This is not disjunct, right? So MPS, um, yeah, there's. I shouldn't say much because I haven't properly read that literature, but there's this. It has the MPS paper in 2009 was very influential, and then people have made their own naively realistic branches of it, and he kept talking of the minimal self and
Mm,
a minimal self as if there was a thing.
mm.
And maybe, I don't know if that's relevant, but one also has to be aware that this whole issue of self is, of course, ideologically charged. There will be a group, whenever you say something about your ideas, Darius, there will be a group in your audience who are Buddhists and say, yeah, no self. I've always wanted to
Yeah,
be
yeah.
and there will be another group who has a strong desire for mortality denial, and something that is irreducible or some ideological thing. So, um, and it cannot be true that there is not something that is untouchable by science or
Mm,
by philosophical analysis. For many people, that's emotionally very important, and that puts a lot of noise on the signal. For instance, I think most of the criticism and uh, resentment I've got in my own country, in Germany, was not by Catholics or people who want a metaphysical notion of self, but by very good leftists who thought this is dangerous because it erodes the revolutionary subject. They didn't read, but the
yeah,
idea.
for sure.
They didn't read it properly. They didn't understand these things, but they said this is kind of dangerous. We need the rational, critical subject, the subversive political
Yes.
subject, and
Yes. Good luck. Well, I just don't. I mean, that sounds almost quite Catholic in some sense that you're invoking some kind of Cartesian thing onto itself that can make itself revolutionarily and subversive. I'm in some sense interested in a far more stripped down form of selfhood, such that I don't even like using the word. I'm more interested in subjectivity.
okay,
I guess no, and it's totally fine. There's a I just think for people there's a very nice Stanford encyclopedic article by Zahavi and Gallagher about self-consciousness, and there they kind of talk about how deflationary we should take this notion of pre-reflective self-awareness to be. And I'm quite interested in this very sort of to the point where the notion of self itself kind of disintegrates, such that you're left with, as I said, the subjectivity immanent in experience. I'm just curious in your when you write that
sorry, footnote before you go on.
yeah,
I, of course, know this article. I
yes,
was always much too lazy to submit one of my own. But this article in the SCP is a political move. It's very clear that it is a political move to establish a certain view on self consciousness
sure.
and exclude others. It's not very balanced. And of course, there is, would you agree? And I understand this, of course, I emotionally understand it. Do you agree that there is an anti reductionist resentment in this? There must be something, that's unknowable, untouchable. Is it?
Perhaps I'd have to go and read it more with respect to that question. I have to go read it a little bit more acutely. I mean, I'm personally. I mean, maybe this is the product of being an early career. I mean, I'm not even in a career, but let's say like an early level researcher that I'm quite keen to remain agnostic about the big questions.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Interesting.
and
Always
be
good.
But also because I don't want to piss people off. And who am I to piss off you or Dan Zahavi
No,
or
no,
Sean
piss me
Gallagher,
off.
right?
Go
And
ahead.
we all no, and we can all be friends. I think that said, I mean, in terms of the sociology of consciousness, I think there has been a slight pushback against. I think you're right that there's been a slight pushback, maybe for ideological reasons, and I think some of it probably is something like terror management against against the reducibility of consciousness. I think that's certainly true. I mean, I'm recognizing even in the conversations I am having a far greater willingness to invoke, at least for hypothetical reasons, something like dualism. And that's
Mhm.
interesting. Again, I'm quite agnostic. I think that I won't say that consciousness is reducible, and I won't say consciousness is irreducible. I guess I'm not. I don't know about the ontology, and I also and my limitations with the ontology in many ways are limitations of my epistemology, right? Like
Mhm.
it could be, it
Mm.
really could be that it's all neural networks and neural firings. um I just don't know, and so I'm quite happy to remain silent where I don't know. I guess the question that I was going to ask is, you say that the content of experience is representational content, and I'm just curious about whether you would say that pre-reflective self-awareness, so the sense that is not intended but is there, that experience is for you, is a content of experience.
It's well, it's never really clear what pre-reflective means. There's a lot in German idealism, in Fichte. We have our own local discussions of this with people like Dieter Henrich and so on, what this pre-reflexive element really is, in which everything is grounded. And it's, in what sense is it pre? Is it that what comes first when you come to after birth? Is it in a temporal sense, pre-reflecting about yourself as a subject? Or is it something deeper? Is it some transcendental, a condition of possibility for everything else? If that's, or is it because the condition of possibility itself will not be something phenomenal. This will not be something you experience. But I think there may be an interesting way out there that some creatures can internally represent the conditions of possibility, say for having a first person perspective, but of course not in words, concept, or propositionally, but in an entirely, sub-symbolic format. This is the enabling condition for things, more complex states I will have later. And the question is, I think your question is, can or do we want to describe this as a representation? I mean, if it is something that is, if the claim is this is something everybody can consciously experience, I mean, this is somehow the claim. You all know this pre-reflexive element. This can, of course, be doubted. That you mean the same thing when you refer to it, and Dorothee means the same thing, and I mean the same thing. Of my attempt has always been to go deeper than that or make that more precise. I pretty much know what they mean, and it's a long, broad tradition from Sartre and so forth, and German idealism, Fichte, and all that. But what is it actually to take it seriously and not just keep saying as a placeholder, pre-reflexive? So the real German term is präreflexive Selbstvertrautheit, and that in English means something like pre-reflexive self-intimacy. There's a way of being intimate with yourself way before any thoughts or concepts appear.
Yep.
That's what I'm also interested in. And I don't know if you would agree, but being self-intimacy is an epistemic notion. Somehow you know yourself. Somehow you are always already in touch with yourself. And I've been, very interested in what the sources of this are. And I think if you look at it, there's more than one source, actually. So, for instance, I don't know the French. So in Merleau-Ponty has this point. They take this distinction of body, Körper. Körper, by the way, relates to the English word corpse. That's the inanimate body and the lived body. And Merleau-Ponty made a very interesting point about what in German is called die Ständigkeit des Eigenleibes. That means Ständigkeit means there is one signal source in the self model which is permanent. That's something like the proprioceptive self model and the interoceptive self model, which is like the background hum of your refrigerator, which is so invariant that you don't hear it anymore
Mm-hmm.
until the refrigerator goes off. And there is something in the phenomenology, the interior perception of one's own body, that has this permanence. And I think that permanence is responsible for some of the Cartesian intuitions that not only you have, but that I have too. Because I think in English you say a substance is ontologically self-subsistent. I think that's the right term you would use.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So a substance, if the self was a substance, it would be something that could hold itself in the state of existing, even if everything else in the universe would disappear. That's a metaphysical substance. Now we find that in our phenomenology. I think this experience Merleau-Ponty pointed to is it's an experience of not only being very deeply intimate and in touch with myself, but continuously holding myself in existence. And what I find so fascinating, this is exactly what Carl talks about when he speaks about predicting yourself into existence. We are actually, yeah, maybe you guide me. I talk.
No, it's just well, no. That face was only because I've been reading so much Le Grand, and she's obviously influenced me.
Have you
Such
ever
that
met Dorothy?
no, I haven't. I mean, I sort of, I would love to. I haven't even reached out to her. This has just been like, it's been a bit of a whirlwind of me just reading her papers and being like,
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. I think in part because in the British educational philosophical curriculum, you're taught that consciousness involves necessarily qualia, intentionality, and subjectivity. And so, for someone to reinforce the subjectivity aspect, I don't, it's like I'm flirting with objective consciousness and subjective consciousness, and maybe it's just it was a nice reminder. It sort of spurred up some childhood memories for me of learning about consciousness.
Okay, I'll throw two things at you about Cartesian intuitions. I have them too. An intuition is something that gets in your way when you do philosophy because it is something that structures your model of reality. Now, the human self model has a spatially extended part, the body model, and it has layers which have no spatial properties. Namely, if you calculate in your head or something like that, if you do abstract reasoning, the phenomenology is you're doing it, it's mental action, but it is not in space, it is in time. So it has some parts of the self model are spatially coded on the level of phenomenal experience, and some only have temporal properties. That makes Descartes' argument about res extensa and res cogitans extremely intuitive for beings like us,
Mm,
for beings with self models like us.
mm.
Do you say chimes?
Yep, chimes with that.
It resonates with our self experience because we are indeed sometimes thinking things, and you've written about it in your forthcoming paper, that when we mentally act, we automatically imply that there is an entity that can control in this way. There's a controller. And of course, the same for bodily movements. Um, so that's why Cartesian intuitions are so plausible. Um, they get in our way. There is something inconceivable in the truth of, say, physicalism or subjectivity only being a very high level irrelevant property. And in this Oxford Handbook of the Self, I've written a chapter called the no self alternative, and I've
Hmm.
tried to explain why everybody necessarily has a feeling there is something wrong with no self scenarios, because the very act of trying to actively mentally simulate a possible world in which there was no self always generates a sense of effort. And that sense of effort is the selfiness, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You get my point? It's
Well, sure. I mean, for me, that I don't, I wouldn't, I don't know how much metaphysical import I would draw from that intuition. I guess so.
it cannot, sorry for interrupting, but it
No, no, no,
cannot be true. For beings like us, it cannot be true. It could never be really intuitive on
no,
an
no.
intellectual level, right?
I think that's absolutely right. Well, I guess my question here, therefore, is at the phenomenal level, not the metaphysical level.
Okay.
Um, so I want to talk about your new book. Um, but before I get into that, so in your new book, you show there's a kind of non-egoic, zero-person perspective, which implies that in some ways there's a it was well again I haven't read too much of it, but it sounds like to me that that one could interpret that at least as the maintenance of a world model without a self model.
Yeah.
I'm curious about whether you before we get into that, what about the inverse of that? Could you imagine that there could be a self model without a world model?
Well,
Um,
absolutely. I bring this up. So, first, this new book, which is open access, available for everybody, the English version, um, is not a scholarly monograph. This is not like Being No One. It's
mhm,
more like a multi-level experiment in popular science. So I'm trying to
yeah.
it's really an experiment trying to inspire a lot of very different people at the same time, which includes practitioners of meditation who may not have no interest in research, or philosophers or even theologians, to offer something to take it out of my hands. So my ideal reaction to that book would be if many people say, nice try, I can do this
Mm,
much better. That would be my ideal result, if people take these bits and teasers and do some proper research somewhere. Now, the question that occurs, of course, in the phenomenology of mystical experiences, non-dual awareness, there's a cluster of phenomenologies I'm trying to document there. For some people, the self expands. For instance, it the phenomenology of identification can attach not to this body and not to the thinker of these thoughts, but to the all pervading quality of awareness as such. That's a well documented phenomenon in advanced practitioners of meditation. So you can become the awareness. But the question is, there are long traditions in Asia who say that is the true self, like Advaita Vedanta.
mhm,
And there are long traditions, like all the centuries of Buddhist philosophy who say, no, 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 there is no such thing as a self. And uh, if you would now, let's just speak phenomenologically about the phenomenology of identification, the kind of phenomenal content of which you could, after the experience, say, I was this.
mm,
Because during the experience, you typically cannot say, I am this. You cannot really say it. Uh,
right.
um, so, that phenomenology, is there a phenomenology of identification with the whole, with the world? Or should we rather say these states are neither self states nor world states, because the distinction doesn't make sense anymore. And, there's this notion of non dual awareness in the contemplative traditions, that there are states of experience, global states, modes of experience, in which the distinction between subject and object makes no sense anymore. So I quote one advanced meditator from Israel at some place in the book who says, "It is not me looking, it is the world looking."
Mm.
So that the whole world becomes the epistemic subject, the knowing entity or something. And as you very rightly point out, this becomes a terminological issue. Some mystics over the centuries will say, "I became one with the world. I still wasn't there.
Mm.
I still was there. I expanded, all embracing." Others will say, a description I very much liked by one person was, "Nobody sitting on the cushion, everything sitting on the cushion." He described this, that like the whole world sits on the cushion,
Mm.
but he's not there.
It's rather heavy.
Uh,
Um,
yeah. So that's a terminological question.
mm.
The way
Mm.
I would like to frame it is that what was previously the egoic phenomenal self model can, in some rare cases, become identical to the computational sort of self model we talked about earlier.
Mm. Hmm.
So,
So the whole thing becomes recapitulated into sort of phenomenal space.
yeah, but it's also as if these states were much closer to the scientific image of the world than
Yeah.
the old biological model of reality, with a self going through the.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, of course. Yeah, yeah. So absolutely, in terms of how neuroscientists take it, it absolutely is consonant with that. I guess my question here is, again, it comes back to this pre-reflective versus reflective dichotomy. When we talk about the possession that these people experiencing expansive states of consciousness, oceanic feelings of consciousness, at one-ment, and so on, are we talking? So it sounded like to me that actually the possession in many ways is a pre-reflexive property of their experience, such that the whole world is seeing is not I am seeing the whole world as mine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course not.
Is there? So I wanted to recognize that there is a difference there, because I think um, I've done a bit of meditation, not as seasoned as you or someone like Lars, but in some ways I found that at those very glimpses of non-dual awareness, there is a kind of very subtle recognition that I would this sense that I am not distinct from that which I am observing. But in some ways that in some ways that is can be paradoxically flipped to mean that sort of I own that as much as I own myself. Um, there's just two meanings really of the word owning. Uh,
Absolutely right. Yes, correct.
and so I'm just curious about, is it really the case that in all of these so-called zero perspective, the owning is all emerges pre-reflectively, or is there also a split where the possession is a reflective, I own this thing, like I own my car or I
Yeah,
own my laptop?
I mean, afterwards, this is also true for psychedelic experiences. Afterwards, some people will just stay quiet and
Mm.
not report this and keep it
Mm.
as a treasure. And most other people will run off and talk about it, and they will talk about it in their belief system, in given the conceptual instruments, their culture, their cult, their spirit, their lineage, their
Mm.
spiritual lineage, their master, whatever their church has given them. And that is actually what I'm calling attention to. This phenomenology is almost ineffable. And if we could
Yeah.
make a little progress, bring a little clarity in there, because it's so obvious that there is an elephant and different people describe that elephant in different ways. And can we make I don't have the final solutions. Can we make some conceptual progress in understanding this? And one thing that will fall out naturally, I think, is that what these German idealists, Fichte, and say people like Manfred Frank and Dieter Henrich in Germany would call this pre-reflexive self-intimacy, and what you have in this Sartre, this whole story, Merleau-Ponty tradition as pre-reflective self-awareness. There's actually something slightly below this, or it can be said more precisely. And I call it non-egoic reflexivity, because I
Mm.
think the really, really interesting discovery the Tibetan Buddhists have made, I don't know, maybe in the 12th century or so, is that this experience of pure awareness has a quality of reflexivity in it. Sometimes, but not always. There's even a term called Rang Rig Yeshe, self-knowing, non-egoic awareness. And I think that is probably the common phenomenological anchor for what all these philosophers try to home in on as pre-reflexive self-awareness, but
Yeah.
they do make the mistake of still projecting some egoic character into it. Some
Yeah. Well,
That's my
quite.
intuition, and there is no egoic character in it.
Yes. Is there perspectivalness?
I'm not the person to know, but person I take very seriously is the world can be seen out of this. So there
Mm.
is, okay, this is maybe, I don't know, getting too much, but there is something that is called dual mindfulness in meditation research, where you would say sit on your cushion and have an experience of pure awareness, and it's all nice and clear and silent, but you're still having it. There's a meditator who has pure awareness.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And then there is non-dual mindfulness,
Hmm.
which is absolutely effortless, no control. Therefore, if my theory is right, that the phenomenology of ownership is called is caused by controllability, then it would not be going along with ownership, as you say.
Mm.
And I found it interesting. Sahavi has at one point used that concept of anonymity, also, I think.
Yeah.
Something that is really, in that sense, nameless and self
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not owned by anyone.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yes.
and my
Mm.
suspicion is every human being, actually, if they're a little quiet and silent and they feel into it, they can experience this non egoic reflexivity in pure awareness. They know what this is. But then later to describe it leads to an explosion of philosophical systems.
Yes. And poetry.
No, but
No, not in a derogatory way. I mean poetry in the most complimentary way. I thought that some of the testimonies of these people were very beautiful. So I mean that not at all in a demeaning way to their
yeah, but
experience.
you see, most of them are not academics, and they don't read things like you and I read. It's amazing how
Yeah, yeah,
they
absolutely.
do their best. They do their best in natural language. But the sexy question is, of course, if given mathematics and computational phenomenology, we could go further. We could
Mm,
have more precise descriptions, maybe a perception in which, in the end, Dorothée Legrand and Jean Gallagher and everybody can say, yeah, that was what we meant.
yeah. Thomas was right.
Yeah, no, not Thomas was right.
No, I know, I know.
But the question is, of course, what are the criteria? Can we have any criteria? I mean, what would convince you? In the end, it's just people talking about their own phenomenology, right?
It is, and I wanted to ask about. this autobiographical retrieval aspect. But actually, before I do, I want to just ask about this reflexivity, because I thought that was a very interesting point, that some of this egoic awareness, non-egoic awareness rather, is reflexive and some isn't. Now, it seems to me that, again, there are multiple ways of disambiguating the term reflexivity.
Yeah.
One,
Mhm.
so one is a kind of reifying reflexivity, such that it becomes a thing that you own, right? So this is my leg is clearly self-referential, but it's also reifying, right? I can sort of dissect my leg as an object that belongs to me. And actually, I think Dorothy again is quite helpful here in her kind of analysis of dancers, talking about their experience of their own bodies as performative and transparent rather than opaque, such that they can take their body as an intentional object without reifying it through what she calls scrutiny. So I'm curious to think about what it means for non-egoic awareness to reflect on itself. How can this be done in a manner which doesn't in turn reify the awareness itself, pure awareness, such that it sort of becomes an encapsulated notion that something is beyond, so that has alterity with respect to something else?
That's a super interesting question, and I think you're just homing in on the target. And I think there's nothing you can do. Doing anything will always ruin it. And as all meditators know, if there's even the faintest glimpse, the noticing of this glimpse very often ruins it,
Mm,
because it
mm,
leads to the reification or some stray thought that says, and as I quote one of our subjects somewhere in the book, who says very interestingly to me, but is this pure awareness? Asks the thinking mind, and something else just knows.
oh,
You know, that's how she describes it, right?
mm,
Something else just knows because it knows itself. And of
mm,
course, it's non propositional. And I mean, there's a long tradition. I have a small chapter on meditation and non meditation, who have always said over the centuries there is nothing you can do. Do not meditate. Uh, One of the nicest present day installments of this is American meditation teacher Loch Kelly. There's a 3-minute YouTube video which goes, "Don't meditate, marinate." The whole idea is this is here, it's
yes,
established.
yeah,
Don't the try to grasp it or experience it, because it's already here. And you have to, if you can marinate in that quality, which in more sober words I've called the phenomenal character of tonic alertness. I think it may be something very basal and very simple in the end, namely just the quality of pure wakefulness as such. And if you don't attempt to look at it subjectively, but like rather dissolve in it,
mm,
marinate in it, then maybe it can know itself through you or something like that. But it needs a lot of future research. And the big question is, of course, also, I mean, what value do we assign to these experiential reports?
yeah,
Many of these people are deep into bizarre belief systems. They are way out of the scientific worldview. Some of them will not, uh, many, but some of them will not be accessible to rational argument. Um, and
is that, well, there are two things
but
there. One is
I'm going to ask you something. So,
yes, oh
if
no, okay,
Doro says in there's a perfect flow moment in
yeah,
dancing where my
yes.
body becomes transparent.
So the body would always be transparent, to use her word. Well, apart from something in like a deafferented patient. By bodily transparency, she doesn't really mean what you mean by transparency, as you actually pointed out in my.
That's different. But if the way she uses the concept of the transparent body,
Yeah.
it's intuitive to you. You have the feeling.
I understand this notion of the world being presented in a bodily fashion.
Aha.
That's really what she means. So there's multiple. So this, for people who are curious, it's actually it's her and who is the other? It's 2009. There it is. Perceiving Subjectivity in Bodily Movement, Legrand and Raven, Ravn. I think Raven also wrote a fair bit about dancing. Yes, I think Dorothy was very much onto what we're talking about here in terms of flow states. But she says, let's have a look. I just want to make sure I don't take her words out of context, or speak on, well, I shouldn't be speaking, to paraphrase Wittgenstein. But I will come to it. In any case,
Footnote.
yeah, go.
If you're interested in all of this,
I am.
I would very much recommend the work of Adrian Alsmith
Okay,
at King's College. Are you aware of him?
I'm not.
He wrote an excellent thesis with me called The Structuring Body.
Yeah,
And this is all about how the body structures the perceptual field or the phenomenal field.
yeah.
And there's a lot you might be interested in there.
Cool. I'll certainly. Well, thank you. I'll certainly send him. I've just looked. Yes, yes. This notion of structuring is is an interesting one. I think I do understand it, but I'm also to some degree concerned about how much I'm getting indoctrinated by the poetics of some of these papers,
Well,
such that I.
if I just need the title, Perceiving Subjectivity. I mean, perception is object representation. Subjectivity is an abstract concept. It invites trying to build a mental model of that of that sentence while trying to
Mm.
understand it. Can I perceive my own subjectivity? Yeah, I can, and no scientist is ever going to take this away from me. you know, and,
What's funny is that you two thank each other so much in your footnotes.
no,
It's
I like her, and she always came as a visitor to the Mind Group. I think it's all very nice, but if you want to take it seriously, I
Hmm.
mean, what does perceiving subjectivity mean? Does this make any sense conceptually?
Well, I think to be fair, I would take the notion that that title is somewhat not tongue in cheek, but it's certainly not lazy is certainly the wrong word, but it's somewhat deflationary.
Uh huh.
I like this notion more of perceive. I mean, again, I'm doing a rubbish job, but it's very important, I think, to contrast it with with what she calls opacity and what she calls performativity.
Hmm.
Um, I think it may actually be the Legrand 2007 pre-reflective self-consciousness on being bodily in the world, which was in Jana's head. Um, it's funny, I've been recommending these papers to everyone, so sorry guys if you're
No,
getting
no, do.
put down the garden, and I recommend yours as well, Thomas, obviously. Um, yes, okay, excellent. A transparent body pre-reflectively experiences the bodily mode of givenness of objects in the external world.
Okay.
This is, yeah, so
I know what
2007.
they mean, but I even say this in the Elephant book very briefly. Givenness, Gegebenheit, there's the myth of givenness, Wilfried Sellers.
Mhm.
The concept of givenness, if we want to take it really, really, really seriously, has strong theological connotations. There are philosophers of religion who speak about the quality of givenness as the world is given to me, my life is given to me by
Yeah,
God, and all that.
sure.
If we take this out. Dare, the Latin, Darius, the Latin means to give. That's a
Yeah.
social relationship between person A and B. So if you say there is a quality of givenness there is an entity that has a personal level characteristic, if I want to take that literally, that gives something to me. So the world is another. Somehow it is an other self that reveals itself to me or gives itself to me as a present. That's poetry. That's beautiful. I think I can experience what is meant by this. There are phenomenologies, but conceptually it doesn't really make sense. There is not person A
Mm.
giving something to person B. Maybe it is something much more like what Buddhists would call the quality of suchness, that there is a self-revealing quality in inanimate objects which you can perceive if you look properly or something like that. That's speculative. So I know no other way of taking what, say, Dorothy says seriously as trying to take it literally. And then it explodes in my head.
Well, I guess the idea
Subjectivity
might
is
be
not
that,
the perceptual object. I'm just very sorry, And
the idea might be well, okay, so I will come to this notion of perceiving subjectivity because I have the paper now in front of me. I think in terms of the givenness, I mean, again, I'm not a historian of phenomenology. This is all, somewhat new given my age and whatnot. But I think some of it seems to be a lineage from Husserl and this notion of givenness. And then I think the other thing that feeds into it is, and I think it probably is proto-religious in some sense, that it's intentionality or consciousness giving its own contents to itself.
yeah, and
And then in some ways this speaks to, God as the divine spark, God as consciousness, and so on, which is obviously a deeply Judeo-Christian idea.
yes,
Do you have any of those? I mean,
but
just
it
out of
might also
curiosity.
map on some predictive processing generative model of reality in the brain, right? Because this is also self-giving all the time.
Of course, well,
It
it's
predictively,
confirmation bias in many ways.
it what?
It's
Sorry.
confirmation bias.
Aha. Aha.
But well, we seek evidence for the priors that are encoded in our generative hierarchy. I mean, that's the base. If we remain the things that we are, of course. Um, I wondered whether that's that kind of claim that intentionality. I use it. I think what we've kind of come to here is the importance and in many ways the opacity that language gives. Right, when I say consciousness gives its own contents to itself, I am constructing a kind of subject, verb, an SVO sentence,
That's
which I could say for "I eat a pizza." Right, but I mean something clearly quite different here. And I think in many ways, of course, it reifies the subjects and the objects because that's what language does. And so, as you say, many of these conversations end up being literally ridiculous because it's very difficult to understand exactly what's being spoken about here. But I think, again, there is a latent ontological commitment in something like that, which is that consciousness is in some ways an agent, has some agentic force to it that is not just a part of its phenomenology, but perhaps also part of its ontology.
aha.
Again, I'm very much. This is not what Dorothy or Merleau-Ponty anyone says. I'm just abstracting here somewhat. You're I guess quite keen to bracket out those ontological commitments, right? This is not a theory of consciousness per se. How the simulation and emulation manifests into phenomenal space is somewhat the big question, right? It's Chalmers' hard problem. Is there anything in you that when you say there are no such things as selves, is there any part of you which goes, but I don't know because I don't know the true origin of phenomenal experience?
Yes, of course I don't. Uh, I might, die in 5 minutes,
No.
and there may be a roaring crowd of angels laughing at me.
Mm.
You know, and there may be all these non-physical entities slapping their knees, laughing loud, and saying, "No, look at yourself without a body. It was all wrong." Uh, Many things could happen the next instant. I don't know. Idealism might turn out to be right in the end. There are these also probably there are metaphysical options, I think, which in principle may always remain viable. And of course, and you can, if you take the whole self model theory, which has many layers, something we haven't spoken about, for instance, completely, is social self models in societies, the
Mm.
resonating process between different subjects. You could turn it around and say, if it allows you to sleep easier, uh, this is a theory about what selves are. Selves
Mm.
are intermittent processes that are absent in dreamless deep sleep. I mean, phenomenal selves, dreamless deep sleep, which are very different and very volatile during the dream state, the non-lucid dream state, and which are sometimes on some layers are quite robust during waking. And we know this, and there's probably like something like a self model. And then if you look closer, you find that a lot of things you've always thought aren't true. So a famous point some meditators make, if you actually attend to what is going on in your head and when you go about your normal business during the day, you don't have to meditate. There's no self there.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely,
You know?
absolutely. Well, there's no. Uh, it just so depends on what you mean by the self. I
Exactly.
mean, there's no self as what I call, well, the self as what did we call it? Reflect, conceptual. The self as a conceptual object. I mean, again, I get into the super granularity of this, as you know, in the footnotes. Because
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
been
yeah,
trying
yeah.
to, and people can read the footnotes of that flow paper, and I think it's an attempt to really unpick, if we hold this dichotomy of self as subject to self as object, where does it linger and where does it diminish? And here, your work on mind wandering, dreaming is super informative. Um, I guess the response would always be, well, you know, underneath all of that, still,
Yes.
the loss of cognitive agency, the loss of autonomous agency, there is nonetheless the subjectivity immanent in experience. And well, the reason why I asked this ontological question is because I think, yeah,
One clarifying question. Do you mean underlying is a phenomenal experience of a really primordial, let's say primordial subjectivity? Or are you saying the enabling conditions are always still there? I can always come back.
I'm talking about the former.
Okay.
I think if there is experience,
Hmm. If that
and
is,
again, I'm reticent to say it, but I think if well, at least I take seriously the claim that if there is experience, there is pre-reflective self-awareness, not just the enabling conditions for pre-reflective self-awareness. There is a uh, a subjective thickness, a for
ah,
whomness to all experience.
uh-huh.
That's the claim I'm making, and I think the notion of this pre-reflective is the fact that it's not a pre-enabler of itself. It's a pre-enabler of higher order forms of self-reflexivity,
Yeah. My,
such that it presupposes the very capacity for that, but in some deflationary sense, that it's always there. So when you get your self-reflexivity, you've always got this sense that there is. But again, when I say there is a sense, I don't mean a sense that you're intending, that it's just there, that that object is being intended for someone or something.
okay. So let's just go through some examples. So Darius has meditated and it has been more or less okay. And then he gets up and he tries to do some walking meditation
Mm,
on the lawn. And then something like a flow state happens. And you can tell your listeners what exactly that implies.
mm,
Suddenly, the walking becomes completely effortless.
mhm,
And only attention is only in the present moment. Um, there are no noticeable thoughts. Um, is that for whomness you're trying to get up? In that case, is it something like the for this bodiness? Uh,
well, in the sense of the walking meditation, I would say that the subjectivity there is punctuated or defined ultimately by a certain bodiliness. Not so much an embodiment, but a bodiliness. There's a sort of bodily thickness to the experience. Um,
yeah.
you know, so
And
yeah, so
is that you feel your guts and your heart beat? And
no,
it's
I
not.
no, 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 I wouldn't say it's as specific as that. There might be some people, an Anil Seth type figure might say, well, you always have this buzzing of viscera and the guts and the interoceptive processes. For me, so I think there's an open question that I was going to ask you actually, and I guess
No,
I
no, I have more questions to you now. I want to understand this. So in being no one, I I've also described this special. I've made these neurophenomenological case studies. There are these Cotard syndrome patients who will
Mhm.
merrily sit in a chair and claim that they are dead.
Yeah,
So they have no life, no lived body, but a corpse. And they will even ask the doctors to throw that corpse away. In saying that, there is a for whomness still, you think?
well, it is Cotard syndrome, Cotard's delusion. I would tentatively suggest that it's still a delusion for whom, in the same way as derealization. um, which to be candid with everyone, I have experienced a fair bit of, um, as a result of anxiety attacks, and there is nonetheless a for whomness in a derealized or depersonalized state.
Okay, more questions. Darius has been stoned out of his mind again, but
Yeah.
he realizes he has to get home, begins walking home.
Mm,
The body walks home while in a completely absent minded state.
mm.
Um, where's the for whomness hiding there?
So okay, so I think there is a point here that I think I can't answer currently, which is whether pre-reflective self-awareness is always pre-reflective bodily self-awareness. So I think that's an interesting question.
Darius is in dreamless deep sleep.
Yeah.
Is there for whomness in dreamless deep sleep? No, right?
No, I would say you're just
Darius is non lucidly dreaming. Is that
yes.
for whomness?
For the subject, for the phenomenal subject of my dreaming experience, I would hold that there is a for whomness within their experience.
Okay. Now Darius reads a Buddhist treatise and comes to the conclusion for whomness is the root of all suffering.
Oh
I
yes,
must
I've read
think
that one.
about the most efficient way to eliminate this. What would he do?
Presumably, I would probably start doing some vipassana, or maybe take some DMT or something. I don't know.
Uh,
Blow my neurons apart.
so you would aim at what researchers call ego dissolution, and then
I would, which I'm skeptical of. I'm not saying I don't. I'm not. Again, I haven't read your entire book. I
no, no,
can't
no, no.
say. Yeah, I'm purely skeptical of this notion of. I think there's a little section of the flow paper where we say, okay, there might be a range of flow states, which includes psychedelic and meditative states, such that you get something like the downregulation of the default mode network and the loss of reflective self-awareness, right? Like planning is prohibited, meta self-conceptualization is prohibited, and I sense that in some of my own meditative experiences and psychedelic experiences and flow state experiences, for that matter. Nonetheless, um, I think there's a risk. or a suspicion that when people are talking about ego dissolution, there is nevertheless a maintenance of subjectivity in their experience, for
That
whom they
maybe
speak.
brings us back to the question you still wanted to ask. I mean, a big epistemological issue I have, there's one very good paper about it by Raphael Millier. I flagged
Mhm.
maybe, why should we believe any autofine phenomenological report about ego dissolution?
Well, I was going to ask that. So I was curious about, how can you coherently report a selfless state of consciousness from your own autobiographical memory?
Exactly. So I see the issue there, and there are some um, attempts to get around it by saying autobiographical memory is constituted through a second order architecture. But I think the somehow the claim somebody, and that's the question, the claims is making that they themselves were having a selfless experience during that period of time, and that cannot be right somehow.
Yes. In
So
some sense, well, yeah, something's gone amiss there.
so the linguistic exposition is somehow faulty.
Yeah.
If it was true, this point I'm flagging and on which I have no, how to say, no official final opinion, this is of course an epistemological barrier for doing research on this, because all people reporting things like that, we should doubt them. We should think, yeah, they had a near selfless state and they're confabulating because they want to have something so much, they are
Mm.
pious Buddhist believers, and they want to report something, they want to report an experience. But the question could be, is there an unconscious autobiographical memory which was running and registering, you know, while there was a conscious selfless experience, and which afterwards surfaced again? There was, by some unconscious mechanism, there was a selfless episode was registered, then is made globally available again, and then misdescribed by somebody who just doesn't know what to say about it, and misdescribes it as their own experience. Um, what would you
Could
say?
you?
Yeah,
Well, I wonder whether even an unconscious memory doesn't in some way involve the self-specifying
that's a
process.
good point. That's a very good point.
Right. So it might not only be an issue of the intentional, the intentions of the subject, such that I want to deceive, I want to confabulate, I really want this to be true. It may just be the very act of lived experience passing into memory transforms it.
Yeah, that might be exactly right. That in beings like us, where, as you said before, self-specifying mechanisms were so important from an evolutionary perspective, also, the retrieval process automatically structures the whole thing in some egocentric self-specifying
Yeah.
format.
Yeah.
It brings up
Exactly. Exactly.
um,
So I've only got a couple other questions. I'm aware of time constraints.
yeah, keep going. I hear lunch isn't ready yet, so
Well, you live a lovely life.
no, it's tomorrow is
There's a
my turn.
no, no, no. There's a slight mention again very early on in the book about intrinsic phenomenological essence of pure awareness. So this kind of, is there a unifying characteristic? Because in the book, you sort of the structure in many ways is sort of the different features of pure awareness. So you have the kind of relaxation, for example, I believe is the first chapter, and there are others. Um, do you what's the kind of conclusion to that question about whether there's a intrinsic phenomenological essence to pure awareness?
Well, this is really just preliminary work. It's more like creating a platform for other people to start from. But there's a summary chapter in which I have tried to extract 5 different readings of what purity could mean. Because also different people mean different things by it. And I'm also this right at the beginning. Most meditators or metaphysically minded people from India will hate what I'm saying. My working hypothesis is that pure awareness is not pure, because it has a content.
Right.
And then the research question is, what kind of content could be so simple and subtle that it makes it absolutely natural for people afterwards to say, I experienced the character of awareness as such, pure awareness. What would that be? And that's what I'm trying to answer. So I don't believe I'm an anti-essentialist. I don't think, this also metaphysically, I don't do metaphysics, but the whole idea of an intrinsic property which something possesses in all possible contexts, I don't believe it. I think there are only relational properties.
Mm.
And only relational properties in the end also fit into the scientific scheme of explanation and knowing phenomena, I think.
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
there is, as many claim, an intrinsic essence to awareness itself, this would be a prime candidate for something that cannot be reductively explained by science. A prime
Right.
candidate, right?
Yes. It's all its own sort of prime mover, unmoved. To go
Yeah,
all the
yeah.
way back to Aristotle. Um, I guess when I think about pure awareness, I also think about pure consciousness events. Robert Foreman's
Yes,
work
yes.
in the 80s, and I got into. I've said this on the podcast before, but I got sort of introduced to that by John Vervaeke, who I know you've spoken to, and John describes the way that Foreman describes pure consciousness events, and I think in quite a poetic and beautiful way. Again, in no ways do I mean poetic in any derogatory manner. That adjectival qualia is lost. So blueness, redness, warmth, and so on. But adverbial qualia remains. And by that, he means presence, nowness, um, here-ness, potentially subjectivity. I wanted to pick up on one of them, which was nowness or presence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You write, I mean, again, these are the earlier works, but you write quite explicitly that phenomenal states, one of the constraints of them is this presentness.
Yeah.
Um, is it the case that phenomenal experiences need to be experienced now? And if so, what does that mean? I mean, what does it mean for this island of phenomenal experience seemingly to emerge, yet not be distinct in some ways from the flow of time?
Yeah. This is where, of course, um, we don't have any clear intuitions. So, how to say, my former research assistant, Jennifer Wind,
Hmm.
who has written this fantastic book, Dreaming, at
Yeah.
MIT Press, we have discussed a lot many years ago about what the step from MPS to MPE would be, what one would have to subtract from minimal phenomenal selfhood to arrive at an even simpler form, selfless experience. And you can see in her comment on Evan Thompson in the publicly available Open Mind contribution that she thinks there is an experience of pure duration, just duration as such. So that the lowest level could be, as you seem to imply, some sort of temporal experience.
Mm.
My intuition is rather, as the Tibetan Buddhists say, nowness is one of the three times, past, nowness, and future. Pure awareness is timeless. It doesn't even have nowness or the mere experience of duration. It is an experience of timelessness. And I think some of my phenomenological data seem to point into that direction. Uh, my intuition is also in that direction, that there is timelessness, that there actually is phenomenology of timelessness. It does exist without
Mm.
nowness. But what I don't know is how to get at this without just doing it completely bottom up with the neuroscience of time representation,
Which I still don't think we really know.
No, we don't.
I wrote this one paper actually. It was a kind of it's a lot shorter than the flow paper, but it's an addendum to the flow paper about the I'm trying to give a computational mechanism underpinning the flow of time,
Uh-huh.
um, using kind of based off Husserlian phenomenology, so retention, primary impression,
Yeah.
and so on. Whatever the last one is, pretension. I guess.
There's
Well, I guess another,
footnote. I have in 1995 edited a high octane collection, which is also a collection which is also available in English. It's called Conscious Experience, and there is a paper in there by German neuropsychologist Eva Runau and mathematician, which is called Time, Gestalt, and the Observer. You may find that inspiring. just a footnote. Time,
that's
Gestalt, and the Observer should be in
time.
your library. 1995.
Oh, my library is expanding all the time.
No, your
Okay, that's.
university library, I mean.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, maybe not. Um, okay, well, before we leave, I'm just curious. You've been writing for a long time, um,
Mhm.
and it's a very sort of marked and productive and quite remarkable career. And as I say, I feel like the focus change, well, not change, but it has a certain direction towards going beyond the basic SMT theory and beyond the minimal phenomenal self to expand into epistemic self models, and then almost like a retreat back into pure awareness. I'm curious, just throughout the whole, 93 up to 2024, I'm just, yeah, I guess I'm just curious about what is there anything that you've changed your mind on? Is there anything that sort of convinced you, like, oh, this part of the SMT needs tweaking?
Oh, many things. Uh, I sometimes play this game with myself. Is where was I really firmly convinced of something and
Hmm.
was absolutely wrong? I give you three examples, and then we can go to SMT. The first example is the German, how do you say, tabloid press
Yeah.
always said the terrorists of the Red Army faction are all hiding in East Germany, in Eastern Germany, and I thought, that's just total nonsense.
Hmm.
That's and that's where they caught them after the wall came down. Second thing is, I thought it would be absolutely impossible that everybody stopped smoking. I thought this would lead to large scale rebellion,
Yeah.
and, and and it happened. So my worldview was completely wrong. So now scientifically, there's a book that fortunately never came out. If you read the Ego Tunnel,
Which I have. Yep.
um, after some long meditation courses in my 20s, I had a few out of body experiences, which also led to research. And I was deeply shocked, because I thought, my God, because they were so realistic. I thought, my God, all this new age crap, this total bizarre nonsense about the astral body and the subtle
Yeah.
body, it's literally true. And man, I can't talk to anybody about this. There's an immortal soul, and it can leave the body, completely. And then I wrote to many people, Charles Tart and Harvey Irvin, and said we need to have an edited collection start research on out of body experience. And I still have no publisher took it. And it was very good, because it would have ruined my academic career at the outset. But there was one woman from England in there, uh, and I hated her contribution, Sue Blackmore.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then Sue Blackmore and her husband, the late Tom Troschenko, were in Germany, in Tübingen, and she had this, this theory that those were very special kind of hallucinations and illusions. And I went down to Tübingen to straighten her out. I thought she was, it's totally crazy because I had this super realistic phenomenology. And then she asked me a question. So when you've moved out of your body and you've come to a standstill beside the bed, what do you do then? I said, well, maybe I go to the windowsill and try to look out. And she said, so how do you do that? Do you fly?
Yeah.
Or do you walk step by step? I said, it's kind of indefined. I think of wanting to go to the windowsill and look out of the window, and I'm there. And she said, okay, what do you do next? I said, well, I go to the light switch to see if my fingers go through or if I can turn on the light switch if I'm only sleep. She says, okay, how do you get there? Do you walk step by step? Or do you fly through the... And I thought, well, it's kind of, I think of the light switch and I'm there. And she says, see, there are discontinuities. This is the cognitive map, as one said at that time, your brain has of your bedroom. And you're just jumping from one landmark point in your
Mm.
internal representation of your bedroom. And between there is nothing. And that made me think. And now I think many out of body experiences are a special kind of vestibular motor hallucinations. And I've done research on it with friends a while ago. And I really changed my mind.
Yeah.
I really changed my mind because this was such an indubitable, realistic phenomenology. And Sue made me see something I didn't see in my own phenomenology. I could go
Right.
on.
No. It's a good one. No, it's just making me think. I mean, one. Well, there are three things. One is that I hate to. Well, I don't hate to, but Dorothée has a really nice bit on out of body experiences. Just for anyone who's, I don't know if you've ever come across this, a 2010 paper.
I may not remember. I have
It's nice. It's a nice paper. It's myself with no body. It's a
to.
very good name. So that's one thing, and then well, I guess a more pertinent question to the actual experience itself was, I spoke about how sometimes I feel that when I read phenomenology, I'm being duped into recognizing in my own phenomenology a phenomenological supposed fact that the writer is put on the page. So Dorothy will say, okay, in outer body experiences, you always have a sense of a bodily self that's intending the objects of the experience. Like, oh, of course. I mean, not that I've ever had one, but I can imagine, like, oh, of course, I can imagine what that's like. And I can imagine, I'm not saying it happened, I can imagine that I would have had, like in your case, I would have an out of body experience. And someone goes, yeah, but it was discontinuous. And I go, oh, yeah, of course it was. And I'm, again, being duped into, through some nice, I'm not accusing Sue of having an agenda or anything, but I'm being duped by the questioning into, because the actual memory, the kind of engram is so fuzzy, because it's, it's a, I can imagine they are, it you're the mind is wanting to take on any rigid form of experience that can be labeled, okay, it was discontinuous. Did you ever reflect on that and go, am I 100% sure that her description is reflecting my my phenomenological experience? And also, how do you contend with that
Yeah, well,
more generally?
one can, if one looks at this in a fine, one can go on. For instance, predictive processing assumes there are priors. One stable prior I had is it is pitch black, dark night, and there is no light in my bedroom. I wouldn't expect anything to see anything on the way to the windowsill where there was maybe a little light from outside.
Mm.
I would expect total phenomenal indeterminacy on the trajectory there. What does it really mean? One can always doubt and come back. And but what I mean, this was really an example of how a bodily sensation structured an environment.
Yeah.
Very clearly.
And
Uh,
just
Footnote:
sure.
there are rare cases. I've said it, I think, in one of the mind-wandering papers, of asomatic body, out-of-body
Hmm.
experiences. First thing one has to understand: there are very different kinds of out-of-body experiences. One you might have in a wake-up phase of a ketamine after surgery may be very different from what a yogi in his cave in the Himalaya has. One you have after an accident. May
Mm.
be different from one you have on a meditation retreat. They are very different. And there are some people, I mean, I've read all that literature in the olden days because I was so fascinated with it. There are situations where people just experience themselves as an extensionless point from which
Hmm.
they view the scene. And that's a borderline case of embodiment. I think one would say, okay, but if you're still spatially located, if your visual perspective is located at some point in space of your body, that's embodiment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, One could also say, is that what we meant by a lived body?
Right.
The origin of a visual perspective? And we don't have a lot of data there.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I guess it was at the heart of your that's the heart of the original definition of the MPS, was that it is spatially temporally centered on the body. This is your
Yes, of course, of course.
yeah.
And I think an important distinction we made is, and that has to do with your interest in in self-specifying processes. Uh, you can have an egocentric, body-centered, visual spatial model of reality that has a center, but not a first-person perspective in the epistemic sense. That can be dissociated, I think. And
I feel
maybe
like that
this
can
is
be.
something you would want to doubt, that anybody can have an egocentric model of reality without a knowing self. Uh,
I think it depends on what one means by epistemicity. Like,
yes.
is it purely a intentional relation? Um, and we haven't even really touched upon this because there's I kind of for actually in many ways it started off as a rhetorical decision, a clarifying decision. I distinguish between an epistemic agent model and an epistemic self model in this flow states paper,
Yes.
and I've been thinking about why I did that. And one is because I think I was using the term epistemic agency to describe something like autonoetic consciousness. So
Uh-huh.
this sense of pre-reflectively driving yourself through time, and I think that's pretty nicely written about phenomenologically and in the cognitive science, and people like Wheeler, and there's a whole literature on autonoetic consciousness that was
Hmm.
very rich. But I guess the other reason why I thought that is that I thought I've actually explicitly said now in the paper that I'm taking epistemic self models to be or I'm taking epistemic agent models to be a subset of epistemic self models.
Yeah, I think
And the
so.
reason why I say that is because I think there are moments of the sense of epistemic selfhood which don't require an
Yeah, yeah,
agent.
yeah.
But it's interesting because in your work you know when you introduce the notion of an epistemic agent model as an epistemic agent model. So do you think that
Very interesting. Let me ask you a question. I know what you mean. So, say somebody sits on their cushion and does a meditation technique that scientists call open monitoring.
Mhm.
So, tries to kind of effortlessly, non-agentively be with the whole phenomenal field, not a meditation object, but
Yep.
everything.
Yep.
And we also assume in a thoughtless state. So there's wakefulness, no agentive precision control attention whatsoever, but there is an awareness of the whole thing,
Mhm.
and no thought, no reification. Is that maybe how to say, the prime candidate of the for whomness you're thinking about? Would you say that this is still for the person sitting on their cushion?
I would. I mean, I would even go beyond that and say that this is it goes even beyond the minimal phenomenal subjectivity, such that it involves some epistemicity, such that there's a
Yeah,
knowing
yeah,
relation,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? And I think this is important. I mean, I guess the question I was also going to ask is, what do we mean when we talk about the sense of a knowing self? Is it a knowing self that uh, is agentically or agentively knowing, such that it's purposefully seems to be purposefully driving itself towards some knowledge, some relationship with the world, or is it or can we disambiguate those two things? So I think a
Brilliant.
canonical example here is mind wandering. I propose. I mean, it's a footnote. It's not particularly relevant to the question of flow, but it's just in terms of getting the terminology really fixed. I propose that mind wandering is an example of uh, it's an associated feature of an epistemic self model, but not an epistemic agent model.
Uh-huh. Well,
Because I think,
you can daydream about an episode.
indeed, indeed,
It gets complex at different kinds of things. But um, so if you read the introduction to the Open Mind collection, Jenny Wind and I have coined the term the phenomenal signature of knowing. And we
nice.
were writing about intuitions and why one should do empirically oriented philosophy of mind without intuition mongering, as we call it. So we think there is a phenomenal signature of knowing. For instance, if you have an intuition, you just have this feeling, I just know this, but you don't know where that knowledge comes from.
Mm,
Now, what I think this new work shows is that there can be an uncontracted phenomenal signature of knowing. Human
yeah.
brains are capable of this.
Yes.
Just the poor, uh, maybe Carl would have a completely deflationary reading of this. Just the overall certainty or probability associated with the whole model. If that is true, this might be very close to what consciousness is. And it might also be close to what you are trying to find out, right? Isn't that it? An, a phenomenal signature of knowing that is not contracted into an agent or a self. Is that what you mean?
Well, I guess the question is, well, in some sense, but I guess the question therefore is, could you have a minimal phenomenal self without without it becoming an epistemic self model?
Yeah, you can. Of course, you can.
But then, in some sense, that then the knowing, the signature of knowing, would not be at the heart of consciousness, because you would have a paradigmatic case of consciousness without the sense of knowing.
Well, if it is basically the bodily here and now, which is a very common, the here and now is a very common meditation experience, it could be that the presence of a signature of knowing kind of falls out of it or naturally reveals it in that kind of state of just being no.
Would it be a necessary concomitant? Could you imagine that there is a pure here? There's a bit where I talk about again. This is just I think actually I'm just going to point people in the direction of the paper, because I have really thought about this, and I guess it's not been in explicit terms in like a conversation like this, but it's just been trying to demarcate these categories. Um, that I don't think the distinction between the I take the minimal phenomenal self here to just be identical to what I've been calling pre-reflective self-awareness. I know that ontological commitments are different, but it was just easier,
Mhm.
and I make that clear. But I make it very clear, therefore, that I don't think that there's a strict distinction between an epistemic self model and a minimal phenomenal self, because a minimal phenomenal self can have this signature of knowing, as you said. Um, but it makes me wonder whether you can have is that signature of knowing an add-on, a build, an extra layer to pure subjectivity, or is it immanent in the subjectivity?
I do not know. I can only
Good question.
share with you the way I'm trying to frame it now. A living organism with a nervous system opens an epistemic space. And this epistemic space can maybe even extend across the boundaries of the body in some kinds of active inference and so on and so forth. But an organism is only conscious. I think the essence of being conscious is to have a model of that space, to know that you, many ways to tell this, to know that you are an embodied epistemic space. And the significance of pure awareness experiences and like this is that you can, well, you can stabilize the model of your own epistemic space, and it's not transparent anymore. It becomes opaque. You can notice it and
Mm.
become aware of it. That's part of the interesting thing. So I would say there's a space. In that space, many different epistemic states can happen. In our own case, most of them are coded as properties of a knowing self that knows, but that's not a necessary condition. Some systems in some situations can model the space as such in an uncentered way. And then you get this pure signature of knowing. I mean, you would find there's a chapter on witness consciousness. Maybe you would find that helpful. I don't know. That's how the way I'm trying to frame this. So a patient in vegetative coma in unresponsive wakefulness syndrome certainly has an epistemic space. It
Mm.
knows how to breathe, how not to die. There are gaze following movements and stuff like this, but it's entirely unconscious because it has no model of its own epistemic space. The organism doesn't know that it has opened an epistemic space. Same thing when you wake up in the morning. I claim that most people know what pure awareness is, but never pay attention to it. It may be the first 200, 300, 500 milliseconds of the waking up process in the morning,
Mm.
where you come to, but you don't know who you are, you don't know where you are, you don't know what place you are in. You're disoriented to place, time, and person, as a psychiatrist would be, but wide awake. That is, the system which you are is just booting its model of the epistemic space. And a second later, there will be the bedroom and it
Yeah.
will be filled with content. But in the boot up process, there's a short period where there's just a model of wakefulness per se, of becoming epistemically open to the world. That's how I would like to or try to frame it. But I don't know if it's correct.
No, well, it sounds well. In my experience, there's certainly that that chimes with my intuitions, or at least my fake recollections of that. I mean, I think you also get that sometimes where you wake up from a very deep, not even in the morning. I mean, I think actually you get a more protracted experience of that sometimes in the
But
middle of the night.
is the first 200 milliseconds, is there for whomness? The thing you're trying to get after.
I still think there is, but has anyone done any qualitative work on this? On the first few seconds? Well, I
I
think
don't know.
it's
Don't know.
what just for the audience and for myself actually. What the one where you talked about the pure signature of knowing? Do you recall which the name of that paper?
Yeah, it's freely available in the internet. It's open-mind.net, the Open Mind collection,
Yep.
and it's in the introduction. It's
Ah,
in an
excellent.
introduction. You can download it.
Oh, what does it mean to have an open mind? Excellent, lovely.
Yeah,
That's a
I think
oh,
I have to have lunch now.
no, have lunch. I mean, you know what? We didn't even touch upon the PMIR, but I think that's for part two. We were touching upon it then, but it's for another time. Because I've got a slight thing to pick with the PMIR, but I'm not going to get into it now because you've got lunch. Um, Thomas, yeah, I'm gonna need a nap, lunch, a bath. I don't know what I'm gonna need to do after this. I really need to take a moment. But this was tremendous fun. I mean, it was tremendous fun for me. I really hope
Same here.
everyone.
Same here.
It's your work is just so terrific. The depth, the lucidity, tackling really, I think, probably the most fundamental questions that there are, in a astute, robust way is like it really is something quite incredible. So, thank you so much for taking the time
My
to speak to
pleasure.
me.
Was very nice talking to you.
The Elephant and the Blind is out now, so people should pick that up and read it. And as you say, it's open access. I always like to just give people a minute at the end just to speak about anything else that they've got going on, / where people can find them, email wise, Twitter, whatever you want.
Well, I have an old English website at the University of Mainz, which you can find through Wikipedia page. Trying to build a new one doesn't work. I don't know. The most important thing for me at this stage is that I've just worked very hard for 40 years. I'm now retired, and I really don't want to work hard anymore. I'm
Well,
practicing this.
congratulations. And you might want to, is there anything you want to say about the foundation or the competition that's currently open? Anything like that?
Yeah, maybe you want to post this.
Yep, we can put it
If
in the
you're
description.
interested in the MPE project, there's a website now, mpe-project.info, and you find a lot of stuff and material there. And there's a prize that with British scientists like Carl and O'Neill in the jury, and by 31st of September we look for formal models for the computational phenomenology of MPE, of pure awareness. So if anybody wants to win 20,000 euros,
Come on, guys.
look at that.
Come on, guys. Yeah, yeah. I'm still thinking. I'm still thinking. I got to read the book first. Completely. Again, so much fun, so much gratitude.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again from me and the Institute. It's been a real pleasure.
Same here. Good luck with it all.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks. Great.